We're going to get started because we have an amazing, really an amazing panel. This is really a great opportunity. We are also doing a live stream, and I did tell the panelists that there are 2.5 million people actually waiting for the live stream to begin. So, welcome to the new school, and welcome to tonight's event on the crisis of democracy in America. I'm Paula, Dean of the New School of Social Research, and I am really looking forward to the panel tonight. We have a packed event, so I just want to get started, even though people may filter in, and give a very brief introduction. This is the inaugural event in a very exciting new series at the new school, the Henry H. Arnhold Forum on Global Challenges. Henry Arnhold was a longtime trustee of the new school and a very important supporter of this university. He died in 2019 at the age of 93, and after he passed away, his family generously agreed to support a forum in Henry's name. Henry believed in the value of debate, he believed in the value of education, and he obviously also believed in the importance of democratic practices. The goal of the Arnhold Forum is to generate high-level discussion of pressing issues of our day, and the forum will host events and will provide research support to our centers and our institutes. And we are deeply grateful to Henry Arnold's family, particularly John and Jody Arnhold, for making this event and the entire forum possible. And it will be here as part of the new school going forward. The forum will hold 4 events throughout this year, all related to issues of challenges of democracy across the globe, its connection to nationalism, ethno-nationalism, and racism and white supremacy. The next event will be a teach-in on democracy, particularly focused at Lang College students, called Why is Democracy in Decline? That will be on November 10th, and we will issue details on the events page. Tonight's amazing set of panelists have each been asked to present to us their views on the contribution of an important thinker on the issue of democracy, nationalism, race, all in the U.S. context. Each person will speak for about 10 minutes about their person, and then we will have a roundtable discussion and time for questions and answers. I'm going to keep it very brief. I want to make a very quick introduction of each of these people who could merit a 5-minute introduction each, but that would take the whole evening, and we want to get on to the presentation. So I'm going to say something very brief about each panelist, and then we will move on to the panel. Jeffrey Goldfarb, who's speaking on Alexis de Tocqueville, Professor Emeritus and Senior Fellow of the Transregional Center of Democratic Studies at the New School. He is the author of The Politics of Small Things, The Power of the Powerless in Dark Times. Juliet, who's speaking on Frederick Douglass, is the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence in Political Science at Brown University. Professor Hooks is the author of Theorizing Race in the Americas, Douglass, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos. Paula Giddings, who will speak on Ida B. Wells, is the Elizabeth A. Woodson Professor Emerita of Africana Studies at Smith College. Professor Giddings is the author of Ida, A Sword Among Lions. Deva speaking on John Dewey, Associate Professor of Politics at the New School, her recent book, Reckoning, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity for Social Movements. And James Miller, who will be speaking on Hannah Arendt, is Professor of Liberal Studies and Politics, Faculty Director of our Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism program here at the New School. He co-edits our online forum, public seminar, and among his many books, our Can Democracy Work? A Short History of a Radical Idea from Ancient Athens to Today. So that is the briefest of introductions to an unbelievably distinguished panel, and so we will turn right to them now. And we'll go in the order on the flyer, so we'll start with Jeff.
Thank you, Will. I'm going to, can you hear me?
Very well.
Now, can you hear me? Yes. Will pulled the fast one on us, and I'm going to kind of let it be known to us to prepare 15-minute presentations. And then a few minutes ago, he told us, could you cut it down to 10? And I sort of was anticipating this because he and I spoke about the event before, and the idea was to do two things: to speak about some important thinkers who illuminate the problem of democracy in our times, and then to have a discussion amongst the group, and then also with the audience to speak about crisis informed by these several speakers.
Authors. So, anticipating this, I was coming down the Hudson River about an hour ago, thinking about what I'm going to do, and I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't read this text, because this text, if I were lucky, it would take me 15 minutes, but it would probably take me 20 or 25. So I'm going to talk with you about what I wrote about. I'm going to try to very, very condensedly summarize my argument. Now, he used to be important in determining my salary, but now that I'm Professor Emeritus, I'm not doing it for any self-interested reasons other than my commitment to discussion and deliberation, and particularly to trying to understand these very, very difficult times we are now in. So, with that in mind, Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in the 1830s, a very different America than the one we live in today. And it's often been noted that he said amazingly interesting things. He predicted the future. He got to the essence of the American idea. He's indispensable for understanding the United States of our moment, and also illuminating for understanding the United States of his times. I'm thinking about the paper I wrote. It was actually framed around 3 different readings I made of Tocqueville. The first one was when I was a freshman in college. And as a freshman in college, that was the reading, the one I just described was the reading that was suggested to me, to read Tocqueville as a crucial analyst of American society then and now, prescient about a whole host of things, and deeply appreciative of the genius of the American political system. That was my first reading. My second reading was, I once wrote a book. I actually wrote books other than The Politics of Small Things. I once wrote a book entitled The Cynical Society, the culture of politics and the politics of culture in America. And this book was in a very central way informed by Tocqueville's inquiry. But it was informed by a different Tocqueville. It was informed by a Tocqueville who understood that democracy, on the one hand, I should say it was informed by an ambivalent Tocqueville. He was on the one hand informed by his understanding, his, in fact, prescient understanding that, the way he put it, democracy is a providential force. He had an understanding that we were entering a democratic age, an age that I think we are now in, where every political project, political projects that we like and political projects that we despise, use the rationalization, the conception of democracy as a central ideal. So I did a lot of work in East Central Europe. And when I was doing my research in East Central Europe, I was studying people's democracies. I had an understanding that these weren't really democracies, but there was a way of understanding of the ideologists of those systems to actually give account for them as democratic. And you know, at the same time, you know, Then, now I'm talking about the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and now dictators often use the explanation of democracy for their dictatorships. So we're on the road to democracy. The people aren't yet mature enough for democracy, but democracy is our end. So that with very, very few exceptions, and the exceptions are kind of revealing themselves in kind of clearly these days. This morning I taught a course with students in Afghanistan. So the regime there doesn't really use the rhetoric of democracy, but many, many regimes, democratic and anti-democratic, use the rhetoric of democracy. And Tocqueville saw this, he appreciated it. He was ambivalent because Tocqueville was an aristocrat. He regretted there were things that were emerging in the democratic system that he was profoundly concerned about. And indeed, I think that the tension in Tocqueville between his kind of understanding of this development of democracy, this development of more greater equality. I have to talk a little bit more about that later. But this development towards a more egalitarian society was where the world that he knew was going. But he regretted that the kind of fine culture that he appreciated. He thought that the fine culture that he appreciated, the idea of quality, the freedoms that he experienced for himself and his class in his society, the aristocratic freedoms, that he regretted that these were under attack. And his analysis of, I propose that his analysis of the United States as a democratic society, as a democratic nation, as a democratic polity, were kind of shaped by this ambivalence. And in my work in the Cynical Society, I suggest that, I suggested in the introduction that I could call the book The Cynical Society. It was about America. It might have been called The Democratic Society. I saw cynicism and democracy in America as two sides of the same coin. Now, this is what's exciting about Tocqueville. There are also things that are very disappointing about Tocqueville. He was a man of his times, and as a man of his times, what he had to say about race, what he had to say about gender and sexuality, what he had to say about, and there was one other thing I wanted to talk about, well, let me say race and gender and sexuality. Those chapters where he writes about race, where he writes about the condition of women in American society, are really problematic. And for anyone who wants to understand American society as the issues of race and gender and other things, I'm trying to remember another thing, but I'm not remembering it. But those two crucial dimensions of our life really have to look elsewhere. And fortunately, today we have elsewhere represented. So that's really great. So the third way that third reading of democracy in America I engaged in is not as an author, not as a student, but as a teacher. And for many, many years, I see Stephanie Brown in the audience. For many, many years, I taught a course on democracy in America at Lang. And most of those years, it was as a freshman seminar. And there, I actually worked with them to understand this tension, to understand where what things we can turn to Tocqueville to investigate. But centrally, it seemed to me that the tensions is what we need to pay attention to, and particularly the tension that exists between democratic ideals and democratic culture on the one hand, his sense that cultural accomplishment is something that has to be refined, and that democracy and egalitarianism challenges that culture necessarily requires judgment about the good and the bad, the fine and the mediocre, and democratic ideals tell us, turn us away from such distinctions. And I think that the part of Tocqueville that's most interesting as far as that goes is the first chapters of Volume 2 of Democracy in America. So, what's the time?
11 minutes.
11 minutes. Okay. So now my punchline. My punchline is that in considering these tensions, Tocqueville thought that the problems of democracy, the fundamental problems of democracy in America, had to do with what he called the tyranny of the majority. And he thought that civil association, the press, what else? Our system of governance, checks and balances, and the federal system would control the tyranny of the majority. So it's my proposition, which I'm not going to be able to elaborate on today, is that now we are suffering from a tyranny of the minority, that the very structures that he thought would alleviate the threats of democracy, elitist that he is, he wanted to turn to non-democratic practices to control democratic excesses as far as the system of governance goes, that these actually are making it so that we can no longer address the fundamental problems of our time. We can't address the problems of a new tyranny. We can't address the problems of race and gender and sexuality. We can't address the problems of the environment. I propose that actually the majority of the population in the United States are paying attention to those problems, but that the very controls on democracy that Tocqueville thought would save democracy from tyranny these days are actually supporting that tyranny. One last thing, okay? One last thing. No, I'm not going to do it. That was a good ending. Yeah.
Yeah, the microphone's there on the side.
Great. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in such great company. And I'm going to dive right in to maximize my 10 minutes. So Frederick Douglass, the brilliant orator, abolitionist, and fugitive ex-slave, has been primarily seen as a theorist of freedom and a fierce critic of slavery. But he also had profound insights about democracy that are especially relevant to our present moment. Douglass's thinking about U.S. democracy in particular is useful given the framing of this panel in terms of crisis. Douglass was at times hopeful about U.S. democracy, such as during Reconstruction, when he believed the revolutionary moment of democratic renewal was underway, but at other times he despaired about the possibility of a genuine democracy in the United States, particularly after the failure of Reconstruction, when white reunion was achieved at the price of Black rights and lynching and racial violence were rampant. I will focus in particular on two key elements of Douglass's thinking on democracy that I want to highlight. The first is his ideal of multiracial cosmopolitan democracy, and the second are his warnings about the threat racist backlash poses to U.S. democracy. Douglass's conception of multiracial democracy envisioned the political coexistence on egalitarian terms of individuals of all races and creeds as fellow citizens. He called for a composite nationality anchored in the idea of a universal human right to migration and the political legacy of the Americas as a multiracial continent. He aspired to reshape U.S. democracy, both by extending equal citizenship, rights and dignity to previously oppressed groups, such as Black and Indigenous peoples, and by being open to immigrants, particularly non-white immigrants. Douglass's formulation of an expansive vision of US multiracial democracy in the 1870s, fueled in part by the idea of a human right to migration, is especially interesting in light of contemporary debates about immigration. Douglass's thinking was based on an analysis of how racial hierarchy had rendered the United States an uneven democracy, which could be remedied by a commitment to accepting non-white immigrants from all corners of the globe and including them as equal citizens. During Reconstruction, in an 1869 lecture on the United States' emerging composite nationality, Douglass linked the fact that, quote, until recently, neither the Indian nor the Negro has been treated as a part of the body politic, end quote, to opposition to Chinese immigration. He observed that those who objected to non-white immigration to the United States often wondered, quote, should not a superior race protect itself from contact with inferior ones? Are not the white people the owners of this continent? Have they not the right to say what kind of people shall be allowed to come here and settle? End quote. To these critics, Douglass forcefully replied, quote, there are such things in the world as human rights. They rest upon no conventional foundation, but are eternal, universal, and indestructible. Among these is the right of migration, which belongs to no particular race, but belongs to all and to all alike, end quote. Observing that it was only by virtue of this same right that European settlers and their descendants could justify their presence in the Americas, he affirmed, quote, I want a home here not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but I want the Asiatic to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here, both for his sake and ours, end quote. Douglass argued that the United States, quote, should welcome all nations, tongues, and peoples, and as fast as they can learn our language and comprehend the duties of citizenship, we should incorporate them into the American body politic, end quote. Douglass was, unfortunately, overly optimistic in his hopes that Reconstruction-era racial inclusion would constitute a permanent democratic recomposition of U.S. democracy. But his ringing endorsement of immigration a century and a half ago is striking in light of contemporary fears about non-white immigration today. Efforts to enact multiracial democracy during Douglass's lifetime evoke many of the same fears and racial resentments elicited today by the United States' changing demographics. This brings me to the second important insight of Douglass's thinking on democracy that I want to highlight. His prescient recognition of the danger to U.S. democracy posed by white grievance, to use a term of mine and not his. Douglass foresaw the possibility of racist backlash to moments of progress towards racial equality, however fugitive and inconclusive those moments may have turned out to be. White resistance has been a recurrent reaction to racial progress in the United States. Emancipation and Reconstruction were followed by the consolidation of Jim Crow, racial segregation, official adherence to white supremacy, racial terror, political disenfranchisement, and xenophobia in the late 19th and early 20th century. Likewise, the civil rights victories of the 1960s were followed by the retrenchment of the welfare state, which was justified by racially coded appeals, and the rise of mass incarceration that continued to ensure material racial inequality despite the absence of mandated racial segregation. And the public euphoria that greeted the election of a Black president in 2008, which was widely hailed as evidence that the US had finally become the vaunted post-racial society it had supposedly always aspired to be, quickly gave way to an era of heightened racial resentment and outright racist backlash. An early example of this kind of backlash were the fears of a Black emperor elicited by the enfranchisement of African Americans following the abolition of slavery almost a century and a half ago. Douglass mocked such fears of Black supremacy, which fancifully imagined that were the United States to end slavery, quote, the Republic would give place to a vast American empire under the sway of a jet black emperor who shall have a snow white empress, a court of all shades and colors, and a code of laws consistently enacted to protect the unfortunate whites from insults offered by the insolent and dominant blacks, end quote. In the 19th century, the prospect of the end of enslavement and the subsequent black enfranchisement conjured the phantom of black supremacy and miscegenation for some white observers. Through the lens of white commitment to political rule, black equality could only be imagined as the specter of black domination. For Douglass, the unchecked racial violence of the post-Reconstruction era was directly connected to slavery, which had warped the civic capacities of white Southerners by accustoming them to economic and political mastery, and to a thorough disregard for black life. White participants in lynch mobs had been, quote, brought up in the exercise of irresponsible power. He argued in Why is the Negro Lynched in 1894. Rather than a problem that African Americans needed to solve, the problem of lynching, the solution to lynching, he argued, was to, quote, let the white people of the North and South conquer their prejudices. Let them give up the idea that they can be free while making the Negro a slave. Let them give up the idea that to degrade the colored man is to elevate the white man. They are not required to do much. They're only required to undo the evil they have done, end quote. For Douglass, then, democracy required that all groups give up expectations of political dominance, that they agree to live in equality. In sum, Douglass, as a democratic thinker, shaped in part by experiences of enslavement and fugitivity, urges us to approach democracy from the perspective of those most at risk. If his part had been to tell the story of the slave, as he said in his last autobiography, the current crisis, our obligation is to approach the current crisis of U.S. democracy from the perspective of those who have historically been least able to reap its benefits. From their perspective, this crisis is not new, but an ongoing struggle. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, God, thank you.
Put that close, quite close.
Thank you, everyone, to hear me in my raspy voice. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this topic. I don't get a chance to talk very much about Ida Wells as a suffragist, and so I'm thrilled to do that, and I'm thrilled to try to. It was interesting. It was a challenge to figure out a way to speak to the topic that Will asked. Ida B. Wells, race, gender, and the struggle for voting rights. A very small topic. Yeah. So what I thought I would do is to try to talk about this and also the Black women's suffrage in general, which is very understudied, that movement, through a story that some of you may know if you follow Ida Wells's biographical details at all, of when she was marching in the 1913 National Suffrage Parade. So that will be the center of this narrative that I'm going to read. I'm not going to ask Will about time, but I'll do the best I can. On March 3rd, 1913, Ida B. Wells Barnett was in a Washington, D.C. rehearsal hall with a delegation of 64 Illinois suffragists. The only Black woman in the group, and she was representing the Alpha Suffrage Club, the first Black women's suffrage organization in Chicago, which she had founded 2 months before. The women had come to march in the first national women's suffrage demonstration organized by Alice Paul and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, I'll call NASA from now on, once led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Paul well understood how to make the parade a spectacle that could not be ignored. Some 5,000 banner-carrying suffragists dressed in white from all over the country would stride down Pennsylvania Avenue on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. As specialists in putting on pageants were hired. Accompanying the women would be 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 20 floats, and an allegorical enactment on the steps of the Treasury Department. Leading the parade would be Inez Milholland, known as much for her striking beauty as for her political commitment. She would begin the procession riding astride a magnificent white horse. By the year of the march, Wells Barnett, now 51 years old, had been a nationally known figure for over 2 decades. She had first come to prominence in 1892 when she launched the nation's first anti-lynching campaign from Memphis, Tennessee. Made an exile from her home on the threat of death, Wells took her campaign across the country and twice to the British Isles. By 1895, she settled in Chicago, where she married Ferdinand Barnett, an influential newspaper editor and Illinois' first Black state's attorney. Recently, Wells Barnett had become one of the founding 40 of the fledgling NAACP. She was also a member of the National Independent Political League, and 8 months hence would co-lead a Black delegation to the White House to confront President Woodrow Wilson for his racist policies. Wells Barnett not only brought individual star power to the fight, she also brought the passion of a long legacy of Black women's activism and involvement with the vote. We may be most familiar with the individual invocations of Sojourner Truth, but as historian Elsa Barkley Brown observed, during Reconstruction, the period in which Wells grew up in her native Mississippi, Black women were enfranchised internally within their communities, if not the electorate at large. They participated in public forums, parades, rallies, mass meetings, and the political conventions themselves. They even served, in some cases, as armed militia to protect men at the polls. No one in the Illinois delegation had been more active in women's organizations, both Black and interracial, than Wells Barnett. In 1892, she founded the Ida B. Wells Club, the first organization of Chicago's Black women's club movement. The club was also the first to become a charter member of the predominantly white League of Cook County Clubs, where Wells Barnett became the first Black woman to serve on the executive board. Indeed, in Illinois, Wells Barnett had found a vibrant group of white suffragists who had welcomed the exile upon her triumphant arrival in Chicago. Women in the state had been working for the vote since 1869, and in 1891 had won a highly contested right to vote in the school district elections. 3 years later, Wells Barnett was part of a successful campaign of Lucy Flower, who was a progressive reformer and founder of the Women's League of Chicago, a coalition of 57 organizations. Flower was elected an University of Illinois trustee and thus the first Illinois woman to hold a statewide position. In the presidential election of 1896, the Republican Women's State Central Committee asked Wells Barnett to canvass the state for William McKinley, who had spoken against lynching as Ohio governor. Ida had a 6-month-old baby at the time and agreed to do so only if she was provided a nurse at every stop. Quote, "I honestly believe that I am the only woman in the United States who ever traveled throughout the country with a nursing baby to make political speeches." These activities paralleled her work with the Black women's suffrage movement. In 1896, Black women, inspired in part by the anti-lynching campaign, organized the National Association of Colored Women, of which Ida was a founding member. By the time of the suffrage march, the NACW had a membership of 100,000 women and a national suffrage department, as well as longer-standing suffrage organizations within the Federation of State, City, and Local Departments. The perspective of Black suffragists was clear. Quote, if white American women, with all their natural and acquired advantages, need to vote, wrote the Alabama suffragist Adela Hunt Logan, a member of both the NACW and NAWSA, how much more do Black Americans, male and female, need the strong defense of the vote? Indeed, Wells Barnett saw enfranchisement as an essential part of her career-long campaign against lynching and racial violence. She had estimated that nearly 3,500 men, women, and children had been lynched between 1885 and 1912. Moreover, as attested to by the vicious Springfield, Illinois riot of 1908, mob violence was no longer limited to the South. As Ida would write in her essay, How Enfranchisement Stops Lynching, this alarming development showed that lynching was America's national crime, which required federal legislation and the election of officials who would enact it. Quote, with no sacredness of the ballot, she concluded, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. By 1913, 7 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment, the suffrage movement had been gaining momentum, recently winning victories in California and Nevada. In Illinois, the stars were aligned for the passage of the presidential and municipal suffrage bill, which Ida and others in the delegation had been working toward for decades. The bill would allow women to vote for presidential electors, mayors, aldermen, judges, and other municipal offices. If this partial suffrage legislation passed, Illinois would be the first state east of the Mississippi to have such a law and would make its activists influential actors not only in Illinois, but in the national campaign for suffrage. Now, Wells Barnett could envision African American women becoming a force in electoral politics, where women could actually vote, beginning with Chicago's deteriorating Second Ward on the South Side, where she and a burgeoning number of the burgeoning Black population resided. Ruled by the Republican machine, which maintained white leadership and Black dependence through graft, patronage, and corruption, it would take women, Ida Wells Barnett believed, to break the machine's stranglehold and improve the quality of life of the ward's 60,000 citizens. The initial step would be one of self-determination, the election of the first Black alderman or city councilman to preside over the second ward. It was in anticipation of the municipal bill that Wells Barnett, with the help of a white suffragist, Belle Squire, created the Alpha Suffrage Club. Wells Barnett had no doubt heard the scuttlebutt that march organizer Alice Paul wanted Black women to march in back of the parade, Jim Crow style. Race had been a simmering issue since the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870 that allowed Black men to vote, but not women. Disagreement over support of the measure had split suffragists into warring factions that elicited racist retorts from the group led by Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Quote, as a celestial gate to civil rights is slowly moving on its hinges, it becomes a serious question whether we had better stand aside and see Sambo enter the kingdom first. Stanton and Anthony are great heroes. The reunification of the factions in 1890, Wells Barnett knew, had not resolved the race issue. In fact, in 1894, she had been a guest of Susan B. Anthony in her Rochester, New York home. Anthony was supportive of Wells Barnett's anti-lynching campaign and was one of the few whites, even among progressives, who had social relationships with Blacks. Nevertheless, Wells argued with the pioneer suffragists who wanted to marginalize African American women in order to gain Southern support for a federal amendment. Anthony characterized the strategy as mere expediency that would be rectified after passage of the legislation. Ida's retort that the strategy would only, quote, confirm white women's segregationist views was borne out in 1903 when Black members of NAWSA were banned from the organization's national meeting in New Orleans. Indeed, while NAWSA made public statements against racial discrimination, indications were that it was willing to sacrifice Black women to appease its Southern members and politicians. South Carolina Senator Ben Tillman, for example, complained that enfranchising Black women, who were the largest group of voters in the state, and who were known to, quote, be aggressive in asserting the rights of the race, end quote, could mean the end of white supremacy. In response, some NAWSA members began to argue that the way to sustain white supremacy was to enfranchise educated white women. As NAACP's Walter White wrote to Black activists and suffragists Mary Church Terrell, quote, if Paul and the other white suffragists could get the amendment through without enfranchising Afro-American women, they would. The racism of white women posed an additional burden for Black women who not only had to fight against the same misogyny and apathy that white suffragists faced, but who also had to convince wary African Americans that women's suffrage wouldn't be more of a benefit to white supremacy than Black empowerment. Quote, if women got the vote in America, the colored race will suffer further ills in legislation, end quote, opined the Chicago Defender, the nation's leading Black newspaper. To be successful, Black suffragists had to bend contending forces of the Black and women's movement to their will. The stakes for that success could hardly be higher. One wonders what Wells Barnett thought her Illinois delegation might do with the segregation order. Though she had worked with them through the years, and they had worked side by side with Black organizations, she had recently chastised the ironically named Chicago Political Equality League for balking at the admission of Black women within the organization. White women like themselves, she told them, was, quote, needed to be, quote, emancipated from the prejudice which fetters their noblest endeavor and renders inconsistent their most sacred professions. While the Illinois group was going over their logistics in the rehearsal hall, they were interrupted by Grace Trout, head of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association and leader of the partial suffrage campaign. Trout announced that Alice Stone Blackwell, one of the national organizers, had advised her that the Illinois delegation be entirely white because, quote, many Eastern and Southern women had expressed resentment about Black women marching side by side with whites. A debate ensued, but the final consensus was that Ida should not march with the group. When she was nowhere to be found at the start of the parade, many in the group assumed that Ida Wells Barnett had decided to boycott it. But as the Illinois women began marching, Wells Barnett suddenly appeared from out of the crowd and joined them as she had always planned. Two white supporters from the group rushed to position themselves on either side of her, and the three finished the march together. As the same Chicago Defender who had been so wary remarked, Wells Barnett proudly marched with the head ladies of the Illinois delegation, showing that no color line existed in the first national parade of the noble women who were in favor of equal suffrage. Soon after the parade, the municipal bill was won, and Illinois legislators were reported to have been awed by the sight of several hundred Alpha Suffrage Club members lobbying in the state capitol against 3 discriminatory bills. The bills lost. In 1915, the Black women's vote was the determining factor in the election of Oscar DePriest to become Chicago's first Black alderman. The Alpha Suffrage Club also supported 2 white women independents for county commissioners. The Alpha Suffrage Club, according to historian Wanda Hendricks, soon became the largest and most powerful Black female voting bloc in the country. In 1930, a year before her death, Wells Barnett herself became a candidate. She was the first Black woman to seek a state Senate seat in Illinois. The election was lost, but a legacy was gained. Black women had indeed become an electoral force in politics. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will be somewhat briefer, I think, but oh, my God. Yes. Okay. So what I want to talk with you about today is this crisis and the tools of thought that John Dewey gives us to think through this notion of crisis and what to do about it. And the way that I approach Dewey's thought is not really one where I sort of go through a kind of recounting of his arguments or sort of try to explicate his concepts in the context of the times that they're in. Instead, I think I try to take a Deweyan approach to Deweyan thought, which is to say, I use what I think is useful and in the context of our livingness, right, today. So in thinking through this question of what is the crisis that we're faced with, it seems to me that what we're faced with is a crisis of despair at the unraveling of the late 20th century order. And now we were led to believe that the late 20th century order, and what I mean by that is the kind of post-World War II consensus, always contentious, always with counterpublics and dissent, but still consensus about a kind of liberal international developmentalism that was sort of like going to carry on, right, carry into the future indefinitely in this kind of very near a sort of steady spiral upward. Now, we were led to believe that this was an edifice that would be undergirded by institutions that, while not perfect, were mostly right, and mostly good, and that we were to sort of to look away from the vast populations that were left out of those, the care of those institutions and social structures, because the story goes, things were so much better than they had been at the beginning of the 20th century that they could only continue to keep it getting better. Well, what the 21st century showed us is that that's actually not the case, right? That order that seemed like an edifice was actually an uneasy truce. And now we're in a moment in which all options are on the table, right? Where the nation, this sort of ideological truth of the late 20th century is no longer dominant. Where people are reaching toward other kinds of explanations for the world as it is, but also other kinds of idealizations of the world as it might be, for better and worse, on the left and the right, and in places that are hard to characterize in that kind of linear progression. And so the crisis, it seems to me, is that we are at a moment where we are stuck some sort of coalitions of folks and some individuals who would like to go back to what they thought of as the stable order of the late 20th century. There are others who would like to, on the right and the left, right, and elsewhere, who would like to sort of reinvent a mythical version of a sort of pre 20th century organization of society that would allow, sort of naked hierarchy and the preservation of a kind of the nascent, the embedded kind of white Christian nationalism that has, as other presentations have shown, always been present, right, in the American project, and has always also been recursive in terms of historical moments in which Americans and the American political system has had an opportunity to choose, right? Will we have a vision that is more like Douglass's vision of multiracial cosmopolitan democracy, or will we have a vision that is more like the white supremacist patriarchal vision that was the compromise after Reconstruction, right? The American polity, through different means, often chooses, again, the reinstantiation of the white supremacist patriarchal structure. We are in a moment, again, when we have this choice, not only as an American polity, but also in the global context. We see this choice reverberating all over the world. But I think that that's because it's this question of what does the future look like if we realize, or if we've come to realize, that what we thought was a steady state, what we thought was the end of history, right, as it were, really wasn't, right? If we have the opportunity to shape a 21st century, what is it that we want to do? What is it that we can do in terms of shaping the world to come? So the thing that I think that John Dewey gives us in terms of thinking through this question is his notion of intelligence, his notion of social intelligence in particular. And so this notion of social intelligence for Dewey is that the ways that human beings are able to shape and change the world is through the understandings that they gain from the fund of human knowledge that exists, right, old ideas, right, combined and related through the world as they experience it, right, and latched onto the invention of something new, right, the invention of something new. So he writes in Liberalism and Social Action, "We are always dependent upon the experience that has accumulated in the past, and yet there are always new forces coming in, new needs arising. That demand, if the new forces are to operate and the new needs to be satisfied, a reconstruction of patterns of old experience. The old and the new have forever to be integrated with each other so that the values of old experience may become the servants and instruments of new desires and aims." This is really important to me, that the old values will be the servants, right? Not the bondsmen, but the servants of new desires and aims. I say this because oftentimes when we talk about our opportunities for going forward, what people do is go back, which we have to do, right? But then they go back and they want to pick a side in the past that they want to be on, right? That's not the office of intelligence, as Dewey would say, right? We do not need to pick sides from the 20th century or the 19th century, as the people are wont to do, in order to understand how to go forward. Instead, what we need to do is to seek to learn what we can to make the ideas that are available to us, right, servants of our aims and desires for the future that we seek to build. That is the office of intelligence. Dewey goes on to say, "We are always possessed by habits and customs, and this fact signifies that we are always influenced by the inertia and the momentum of forces temporarily outgrown, but nevertheless still present with us as a part of our being. Human life gets set in patterns, institutional and moral. But change is also with us and demands the constant remaking of old habits and old ways of thinking, desiring, and acting. The effective ratio between the old and the stabilizing and the new and disturbing is very different at different times. It is not that It is not that our society creates that need, but that the necessity for the adjustment defines the office of democratic action, right? So it falls to us, right, if we are able to employ this method, right, of social intelligence, to use democratic action. And this democratic action, by the way, may not be contained in sort of officialized institutions. I don't mean only the ballot, for example, right? But to use democratic action to understand and also shape the balance between the old and familiar, the things that may be temporarily outgrown, but nevertheless are still with us, and the new and disturbing. What I really find inspiring about this notion of social intelligence and its relationship to democratic action is that it gives human beings who are alive today it acknowledges our capacity as human agents to shape the world in a way that I think that our sort of 20th century understanding of liberalism tried to take that agency away from us, right? Meaning that we've already designed, right, the idea that I at least grew up with was we've already designed the right system, right? We just need to implement it in a way that is fairer, right? And so all the people writing from all of the different traditions of political thought who've been saying all along, actually, no, like, this doesn't actually work, right? It doesn't actually include all the people it's meant to include, and it can't, because actually it's built on the notion of certain exclusions, right? Perhaps we cannot recover it whole cloth, right? There are people who've been all along sort of writing in that tradition. But we were nevertheless there was a sort of dominant, hegemonic, shall we say, notion that no, basically all of these institutions, all of our kind of beliefs are the correct beliefs. We just need to implement them in a way that is fairer. But what I think this notion of social intelligence allows us to do, this pragmatic social intelligence allows us to do, is to look around and say, actually, maybe we didn't get it right. But we are possessed of a power as human agents, as human beings in the world, as human beings in relation to one another, to continue to invent and implement a world that we wish to share. We are as entitled to do that as people were in the 1700s and the 1500s and the year 400 and in the year 1. And that's something that I think that many of us have forgotten, and something that when I read Dewey, I always remember.
It's going to be helpful.
I want to start by saying a few words about how everyone's thinking about insurrections and constitutions, as these topics are discussed in our 1963 book on revolution. It's also worth recalling that book's disquieting introduction. Entitled War and Revolution, Arendt here discussed how a proliferation of nuclear weapons had dramatically changed the stakes of resorting to armed force in any emancipatory struggle for self-determination. That was one reason I think that Arendt tried in On Revolution to separate sharply, at least in theory, brute violence from the benign kinds of power and collective freedom made possible, she thought, only by the creation of free political associations like the world's first democracy created in Athens in the 5th century BC. Throughout her book, Arendt insists on the active assertion of shared political freedom as the essence of democracy, as a modern experience as well as an aspirational ideal. For my part, I want to stress here that the active assertion of shared political freedom often, if not invariably, involves violence. And that such violent popular uprisings are, despite what Arendt asserts, not an unfortunate
the mission of a peaceful forward march toward a more just society. Rather, as a matter of fact, they form the heart and soul of modern democracy as a living reality. Of course, as Arendt herself stressed, these episodes of collective self-assertion are invariably fleeting. I'm going to talk for 5 minutes. Violent uprisings.
Violent uprisings stand in tension with the need for a more stable constitution of collective freedom, embodied in a written rule of law and in representative institutions that can operate at a larger and more inclusive scale. Unfortunately, as Arendt also understood, all such large-scale, putatively democratic representative institutions will frustrate anyone hoping to play a more direct and personal role in political decision-making in an effort to experience firsthand what Arendt herself regarded as the joy of political freedom. But this means, and I am speaking for myself now, though Arendt knew this too, that the democratic project, both ancient and modern, is both unfinished and inherently unstable. Repeatedly frustrated in practice, whether by unelected technocrats and bureaucrats, or to take another contemporary example, by a structurally racist carceral regime that empowers police more than ordinary citizens, the modern promise of popular sovereignty recurrently produces new efforts to reassert through direct action the collective power of a people. Hence, I think, our current predicament. Even though the post-war consensus over the meaning and value of specifically liberal democratic institutions seems more fragile than ever, democracy as furious dissent flourishes as rarely before, I don't think it's in retreat, in vivid and vehement outbursts of anger at remote elites and shadowy enemies, and these outbursts are essential to the continued vitality and viability of modern democracy, even as and precisely because they challenge the status quo, destructive though that challenge may be. In my last book, Can Democracy Work?, I argued that modern democracy was born not in America, as Arendt consistently implies in On Revolution, but rather in Enlightenment France, out of a deeply radical claim driven home by armed force that all legitimate political power belongs by rights to a sovereign people. Arendt, by contrast, consistently compares the French unfavorably with the Americans, asserting that in France in 1789 and after, quote, strength and violence in their pre-political state were abortive. But that's simply not true. The storming of the Bastille wasn't abortive, as even Thomas Jefferson, who watched it happen, understood at the time. The violence of the mob, and Jefferson himself approved of the heads they paraded on pikes, was in fact demonstrably productive because it opened a new public space, making it possible for Condorcet, a great political philosopher whom Arendt barely mentions, to write the world's first avowedly democratic constitution in 1793, proposing a nested series of popular assemblies extending from face-to-face local meetings to a national assembly of democratically elected delegates. Moreover, the constitutive links between the recourse to armed popular uprisings and democratization didn't stop after the French Revolution. Just consider the fraught contemporary case of Ukraine, which also speaks to Arendt's well-founded anxiety about how nuclear weapons have transformed the stakes of political violence. Ukraine's revolution of dignity began in peaceful protest, but eventually became violent when the regime used force in its attempt to stay in power, and the insurrectionists responded in kind. At the same time, the Maidan revolt, largely peaceful though it was, obviously helped unleash a course of events that has led to the current war in Ukraine, which is a battle in part over the future of a fragile liberal democratic project forged in a bona fide insurrection. In other words, in our own day, and certainly in Ukraine, where a limited nuclear war is now openly regarded as a possibility, the struggle for political freedom and self-determination has become hopelessly intertwined in reality with the use of armed force that may at any time become catastrophically violent. The situation is scarcely less fraught in America today. We were gathered tonight to reflect on our democracy in crisis. But what is the nature of our crisis? According to President Biden, as if in an unconscious echo of Arendt, one crux of our current crisis is the infatuation of some partisans on the right with political violence. Quote, "You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-democracy," Biden sententiously proclaimed in a primetime speech before Labor Day. Quote, "You can't be pro-insurrection and pro-American." And it's certainly true, as Arendt describes in On Revolution, that most of America's political founders were deeply fearful of armed popular uprisings that might challenge elite rule. By design, the United States Constitution was anti-majoritarian. It was a republic, not a democracy. It was designed to tame the political passions of commoners, to diffuse the potential for mob violence, in effect to blunt social intelligence before it could take root. But not all Americans were happy about the limits placed by the Constitution on popular sovereignty. Almost immediately, in part under the influence of the French Revolution and its radically democratic principles, some Americans rose up in rebellion against the anti-majoritarian federalist government. Inspired in part by the Jacobins in France, they started political clubs, which at the time were illegal, in order to fight for giving more power to ordinary citizens. This grassroots agitation in turn gave rise to America's first national party, explicitly avowing democratic ideals. Ever since the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson was elected as our third president, core aspects of America's constitutional regime have been altered through an incomplete process of democratization, often fueled by volatile, sometimes violent mass movements. Notably in the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson forged what is arguably the world's first effective mass political party, and then again in the 1860s, when Americans fought a civil war over whether or not to abolish slavery and to extend citizenship to black as well as white Americans. Ours is a country born in an anti-colonial insurrection, made more democratic by successive, sometimes racist, grassroots movements, like that propagated by Andrew Jackson's Democrats, resurrected by Southern populists in the 1890s, and resurrected most recently in the storming of the Capitol, born again as a multiracial ideal in our Civil War, born again in the often brutal struggle over black civil rights in the 60s, and born yet again in the Black Lives Movement of our own day. In other words, violence in the name of democracy is an essential strand in this country's political DNA. Moreover, the very meaning of modern American democracy is precisely what I think was at stake in the insurrection of January 6, 2021. Progressives, liberals, and socialists need to remember that we have no monopoly on the rhetoric of modern democratic idealism. On January 6, a significant group of our fellow Americans laid siege to what they perceived as a distant fortress, the federal government. They attacked officials and institutions that they believed had usurped the powers of ordinary people, whose legitimate sovereignty their duly elected president was rightly seeking to restore. Ironically, Americans today are in fact overwhelmingly united in believing that democracy is in crisis. A Quinnipiac University poll recently found that 69% of Democrats and 69% of Republicans say that democracy is, quote, in danger of collapse. It's just that one side abhors a multiracial ideal of American democracy, blames President Biden and so-called socialist Democrats, while the other side fears A restoration of white supremacy excoriates former President Trump and those Biden has labeled derisively MAGA Republicans. My conclusion is brief. The use of armed force often proves unavoidable in the real world of modern democratic politics. It has proved so in Ukraine, it proved so in America's Civil War, and it could prove so again. I think that Hannah Arendt was absolutely right in her introduction to On Revolution to stress the escalating risk to the future of our planet posed by such recourse to armed force, especially here and now when the renewed proliferation of nuclear arms and the renewed threat of what Biden recently called a nuclear Armageddon. In short, what's potentially at stake around the world in currently violent struggles over self-determination and the proper scope of political freedom couldn't be greater. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Incredible discipline with the timing, Jim. I'm sorry to report that to you. You were very disciplined. We have a little time left for a quick round of comments from the table, and I'm going to give you each 1 minute. If you have anything you want to add around what you heard from the others, step away from your person that you so beautifully represented, and you don't have to speak, but the floor will be open for the table for 5 minutes, and then we have an audience that I'm sure has questions and comments. So floor is open for the table to speak to the issues of contemporary democracy, its challenges, and why this view that democracy in crisis is so popular and so widely shared. Any comments from the table?
Social intelligence is in big trouble given the current reign of social media, the internet, and the very sophisticated manipulation of public opinion by professional psychologists and marketers. And I don't think that John Dewey ever came close to meeting the problem of public opinion. He knew it was a problem, but he could never answer Walter Lippmann. So I can't share your hope on that score. In fact, it fills me with despair.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, I mean, for me, I think Dewey did answer Lippmann. So I think I'll present the same kind of answer to you. It's true that the internet can be a swamp filled with misinformation, that's detrimental to the capacity for social intelligence. It's also true that it's the greatest index of human knowledge that has ever existed. What matters is how people use it, not what it is. It's just a tool, like the printing press, right? You can print stuff that's lies, that widely circulates, or you can print things that stimulate people to interact with the empirical, the material world in different ways. Like, I don't know, for me, pessimism is not a politics, so I am not interested in it. I want to live. And so what does it mean for us to develop a politics where we can live and thrive? Some of that will be violent and disruptive. I certainly agree with you there. I mean, I must only agree with you there. That's empirically true. And, violence, particularly in the, violence can serve its own purposes, as we learned from Fanon, right, and others. But in the end, I think that what we have to be concerned with as, a human population is how do we live and thrive? And if that is not our chief concern, then we will perish.
I just think without resolving the issue of race, none of it's going to happen.
Agreed.
And I am, and I'm certainly not an expert on Tocqueville, Arendt, or Dewey, but I'm amazed how smart they were, but never understood the centrality of race. None of them did. Which seems to be a real a shortcoming, and I'd love for you all to talk more about that. If I heard, I didn't hear everything around the violence argument, but one of the things about January 6th, it wasn't just an uprising, it was an uprising to stop a certified vote, to keep the vote from being certified.
Right.
Right, the election from being certified. So that's so that was just a little different. And just lastly, I was reading something that you might want to also respond to about Tocqueville being a critical race theorist.
Whoa.
because of his feeling that because white privilege, as he said,
Right.
is endemic, right, to American culture and jurisprudence, in which he agrees with the critical race theorists on that.
Yeah, I mean, except I'm not sure he saw anything wrong with that. You know,
Right.
but you know, in the longer version, you know, in the full version, my presentation. First of all, I actually want to argue that his Tocqueville's approach to democratic culture is in some ways an anticipation of Dewey's idea, or the way I read Tocqueville is an anticipation of Dewey's idea of social intelligence. But that may be because I'm influenced by, my reading is influenced by Dewey. So I'll give you that. But this tension that exists between kind of intelligence and the need to kind of develop it on its own terms, and then also responding to popular concerns. You know, that's a puzzle. I also thought that Dewey, I'm not convinced that Lippmann won the debate with Dewey. You know, and as it applies to media, I think that, or social media, the internet more broadly, as I said during my talk, I'm working with these students at the American University of Afghanistan. They're in Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, other places, up the Hudson at Bard College, and we're having real classes, and that tells us something about the potential of our new media. And I think it is a grounds for struggle, and Jim's concerns are really serious. But also observing the way it empowers is serious. Now with Tocqueville, again, I actually said something about it in my paper, that he saw the race conflict. I'm not sure which. You know, I don't think he was on the right side, but he did see the kind of endemic problems of racism in American society. So that's interesting. But he saw the endemic problems in American society only as a prelude to disaster. You know, so he kind of was realistic, and he was a kind of good pre-social scientist, but he saw it as leading to disaster. He didn't anticipate, and he could have, Frederick Douglass. The idea that that people of different races actually could empower each other, could be more echoing Arendt's idea, the idea that could meet each other as equals in their differences and create something greater. That's not in Tocqueville. And I just want to say something about Jim. Jim, I think, conflates social movements and violence. And I think often there are social movements that are predicated on nonviolence, not necessarily because of some moral position, but because of some realistic, pragmatic calculation that we know who has the guns, and the way we're going to achieve our ends is actually through nonviolent means. And I think this is actually the distinction between contemporary movements on the left and the right. Maybe because of an accurate portrayal understanding of who has the guns. So on the right, there's much more acceptance, celebration of using the guns than it is on the left, and I think we're actually suffering as a consequence.
Juliet, you want to take the mic?
Yes, I'm just going to say something really briefly. One is that I actually cut a piece of my talk that was going to be about Douglass as lawbreaker that there are moments in Douglass where he really talks about that we have an obligation to resist unjust laws and not just not follow them, but to resist them. And that I think is in light with your arguments. But I also think that, that we also need to think about these moments of, like the January 6th insurrection, not just as a kind of expression of democracy, but also as a moment when there was a collective refusal to actually engage in a key democratic civic capacity, which is to accept loss, right? If you lose an election, you're supposed to accept, and if you don't, you can't really have democracy because your side is never always going to win. And so in thinking about that, I think there is part of the problem right now is also the sense that, that there is a lot at stake. I agree with that, but there's also a sense that having a shared democracy is a loss and that cannot be accepted.
That's a good point on which to turn to the audience for questions or comments. And there is a microphone here. Again, we're being live streamed, and we'd love it if you would speak into a mic. I think that moves, that microphone. But anyone have any comments they want to raise?
Is it a robot?
Go ahead.
Hey, I'm Javier. I'm an alum here at NSSR. Thank you all for the talk today. This question goes mostly for what Professor Woodley was saying about we're entitled to imagine new forms of organization as the people in the 17th century were, as the people in year one were. And it seems now that we've come to a time, I'd say, where liberal democracy is very, very troubled, and now we're seeing new political discourses that, we see what's going on in Brazil, we see what's going on in Italy, and we're seeing how liberal democracy is becoming to be more and more in crisis, and there's these new discourses that gotta be very problematic. So, of course, I'm not expecting a full answer here, but what do you think are some possible new scenarios of how we can reimagine new forms of democracy and new forms of governance?
Well, as it so happens, I've recently been in conversation with lots of people about this. I think that I'm interested in abolition democracy as as Juliet knows, as an alternative. And when I say that, I mean thinking through what it means to have. Okay, so this is actually kind of long. So if we think about the way that liberalism anchors democracy, it is largely in a kind of reliance in institutions, rights, and design, right? And I'm saying that just as a descriptive matter, right? It is the case that at this moment, right, the institutions that have been designed and the regime of rights that has been conceived, right, including the regime of human rights that has been conceived, is not up to the challenge of actually delivering well-being to the majority of people in the world most of the time, okay? So just simply on those grounds, people have gone looking, right, for other sorts of things. Some people have looked and said, hey, fascism, it's an option, right? And so, well, they have. And so that's one option. But people are also questing after other kinds of forms that are more like the sort of multiracial democracy that Douglass talked about, but also that forms of democracy that attempt to not be aligned with carceral and the sort of carceral and security regimes that have also characterized liberalism. And we see examples of this in, for example, Colombia, right? And for example, places where they're rewriting their constitutions, right? So we're seeing pushes in all directions, right? It's not the case that we already know where the balance of power will lead. But it is certainly the case that everything's up for grabs, and I think that we need to take the notion of abolition democracy quite seriously, because it is grounded in responsive relations of care, as a colleague of mine has written, Anne McNevin is writing. I think that that is what people are actually searching after in the end.
Hi, I'm Rob Mass. I'm a PhD student in the New School. One concept I didn't hear anybody discussing here is civic virtue. If you're going to have an explosion of democracy with people who are crazed by the internet and by the other sources, it's going to be a disaster. So my question to you is, do you have any thoughts about how we can inculcate, whether it's self-interest rightly understood or some other form of virtue, so people will listen to one another or work with one another? Because I don't see that much today.
A standard answer, going back to John Stuart Mill, is that participation will become a great school of civic virtue, and that it will unleash social intelligence of the sort that Deva's talking about. It's interesting to me that there's not a whole lot of empirical studies that actually show that. And in fact, some of them show, in terms of the polarization effects in consensus-seeking organizations like the Students for a Democratic Society during their high consensus phase that I studied in a prior book, that you end up actually empowering the extremes. And one of, I think, the great challenges is for the sort of successors of the New Left who are trying to avoid the pitfalls the New Left faced, which after all slid into terrorism, and it became quite ineffective, is how do you, is there a way to, in a local way, empower people and allow them to see and imagine alternative futures that in their everyday life they can imagine, without having a kind of fetishization of process, which perversely and repeatedly, in many examples I could think of, the Green Movement in Germany would be another example in the 1980s, ends up with what was not intended at all, which is the calcification of an unaccountable leadership that claims to be democratically pure. And this is a complex institutional problem. Deva has worked on it in her most recent book, and she can talk about it more. And there is a lot of disagreement among empirical social scientists and historians about what actually happens in these movements. And so we could have a whole other forum on that. But Deva, please.
Well, I just want to make a distinction between, in terms of the empirical data. So it's true that political participation can increase polarization, although it also can have these civically virtuous effects. So that's a mixed bag, kind of empirically. But that's political action. Civic action actually has the good Deweyan effects. So meaning to say that when people are working together to do things that may not be directly political, it has these kinds of, trust, social capital kind of effects, right? And so we did, and for example, during the pandemic, we saw an explosion of, for example, mutual aid networks, People who were doing things with community gardens, people who began to offer sort of free services because they had the time. One thing we haven't mentioned much of, just really quickly, is one of the things that steals the civic time from us is the political economy that we're under, right? Which demands wage labor from us all the time, so that we don't have as much time for civic action. And that was one of the things, for example, in the 2020 uprisings that was so key, is that we actually had a pause in our political economy so that people could pay attention and do things. And the things that they did were pour into the street for protest, but they also were the ones who were setting up these mutual aid networks and the friendly fridges that popped up and the community gardens that were distributing across their local neighborhoods. And it's partly because people had time to do something other than work for a wage. So that's something to consider.
Very briefly, I just want to highlight the implications of Deva's answer. I would like to highlight the implications of what Deva just said, and actually use it to critically evaluate something else that she said a little earlier, and that is, as someone who worked in the democratic opposition in Eastern Europe in the 1970s, 80s, and 80s, and as someone who's now working with people in Afghanistan, I'm just not so ready to discard the idea of liberal democratic institutions. And but on the other hand, I think that we have to not think that these political institutions kind of solve all problems or that they're flawless, that we have to actually understand that they need to be knitted into social life. And our imaginations about the future, I think, should have some fundamental agreement about basic democratic representative institutions, liberal rights, and so forth, but that it needs to be empowered by social movements. And I think that in social movements, echoing what Deva said, the kind of social capital that's necessary to act in a way that Tocqueville recommended and thought he saw in America, individualism properly understood.
One more question.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Browner. I teach here at the New School. And maybe we need storytelling, because I think it is the biography of Ida B. Wells that you tell, Professor Giddings, that helps here. It is a story that has someone doing civic action, political action, writing, using social intelligence, sort of nonstop on so many different issues throughout her life, from lynchings to women's vote. And it strikes me that when we only have the theorists, we sometimes forget what we learn from someone like her life and what you were just saying, Deva, about sort of the local action that is writ small, but over time it tends to, and I agree with you, Professor Giddings, that if you're not attending to race, you're simply not thinking about democracy. So if you could say a little bit about how you see the biography you wrote and the life of Ida B. Wells speaking to this question of the crisis of democracy today, that would be great.
I didn't hear all that you said, but I think I got the most of it. And thank you for that question. Ida B. Wells, one of the things that distinguishes her from her peers is that she understood that the social contract had changed after the Civil War, and that the social contract was no longer if one behaves in a particular way, in the proper civic way, if one gets educated, if one accumulates wealth, then first-class citizenship is guaranteed, which has a great implication around behavior and around the politics of minority communities and of the Black community. And she said she realized that that was not the social contract, in fact, that there's economic competition, and in fact, the more you succeed, the more vulnerable you might be to getting lynched, right? So her idea it was a very interesting idea because she kind of moves into a more modern concept of thought. There was great, in the Victorian period, of course, there was a great feelings about keeping violence down, keeping conflict down. People were very fearful of mobs. People were fearful of tension, which had implications in the way the black community leaders behaved. But she said that conflict, in fact, was inevitable as well, that tension was inevitable because you had to protest, because it wasn't going to come automatically. It wasn't going to be earned by good behavior. Good behavior was not an agent of change. Right. So, which
That's the conclusion of this group.
But on the other hand, and I wanted to ask one small question related to that to our two non-New Schoolers on the panel, which is about enfranchisement and the ballot. And you both mentioned it. You in response to Jim, and you, of course, in the narrative in the biography of Ida B. Wells, and just whether the kind of voter suppression today, because you both kind of gave it a certain prominence that I hadn't heard from the other panelists, whether the kind of voter suppression we're seeing today represents to you the crisis, the kind of the most visible aspect of the crisis of democracy.
Well, certainly if you think that voting is central to democracy, it's a tremendous crisis. But it's not a new crisis.
Right.
So, that has always been, I think, I'm sure this is oversimplified, but the U.S. is, and other societies, but particularly the U.S. is divided between those who think the U.S. is better off if people have rights, and those who think the U.S. is better off if only certain people have rights. And that has always been. And so we're seeing a replay of maybe on a national level that was always in certain areas in the country. And we should learn, I think, from those lessons.
Go ahead. Then we'll have one final comment.
Yeah, so I absolutely think that attempts, the continued attempts to suppress the votes of racial minorities and the casting of such votes as illegitimate and of democratic victories as inherently illegitimate because they're based on a multiracial coalition is a serious problem. And I think but I think I agree also with the point that, this has been an ongoing crisis. This is why the crisis is not new. This has been happening. And I think instead of listening to the miner and the canary, right, we would get these news stories about like, oh, look at this heroic black voter, this 80-year-old woman who stood in line for 6 hours in order to vote. That's not a sign that democracy is working. That's a sign that democracy is in disrepair. And I think we instead turn it around into this example of civic virtue instead of listening to it as a symptom of the crisis of American democracy.
Well put. I want to say that we're also very lucky tonight to have Jonathan Fanton in the audience, former president of the New School, and I'd like to ask him to say a word before we close.
Thank you. When I became president in 1982, the first new trustee I recruited was Henry Arnhold. And Henry provided both the intellectual and moral and financial commitment that enabled us to literally save and rebuild the graduate faculty. He also supported our efforts, which Jeff led, to work with scholars facing repression in East and Central Europe during the 1980s, and was very pleased when Jeff began the Democracy 2.0 seminar. And I simply want to say to the panelists and to Will, Henry would be very pleased and proud to have listened to this conversation, which is not a conversation that happens at very many, if any, universities around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Beautifully put, and deeply grateful to an amazing panel, which did a lot of heavy lifting in a short amount of time. And I think it really moved us forward in our thinking about where we are in America today. Thank you so much.